Just 19 years before the sinking of the Titanic, a White Star Line ship known as the Noronic disappeared in 1893 while sailing from Liverpool to New York. And to this day, it's uncertain what actually happened, owing to the fact that there were no survivors. So what would the history books have written about the Titanic had the wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, not fixed the Titanic's Marconi radio just a day before that fateful collision with the iceberg? If there were no distress calls sent to other ships explaining what had happened, and if none of the survivors were saved to tell the story of that fateful night, would the Titanic have also been known as another White Star Line ship that simply disappeared? Well, the truth is, had it have not been for the efforts of the wireless operators breaking the rules and fixing the radio system just hours before that fateful collision with the iceberg, the radio system may not have been in a good enough condition to call for help and save the passengers of the Titanic. And whilst there was an emergency backup radio system in the event that the main Marconi system was down, it only had an approximate range of 50 miles. And although the Mount Temple was one of the closest ships to the Titanic, at approximately 50 miles away, it was also at the maximum contact range to hear the Titanic's distress call. So there was a good chance that the distress calls may not have reached the Mount Temple, and not least the Carpathia. Hello and welcome to Queens of the Ocean. Whether you're a Titanic enthusiast or simply enjoy ocean liner history, in today's video we'll be going back in time to take a closer look at how the efforts of the wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, ensured the survivors of the Titanic lived to tell the tale of that harrowing night the Titanic sank. A story that would go on to capture the public's imagination to this day. A few days into the Titanic's maiden voyage, the Marconi radio suffered from a faulty component which rendered the radio system practically inoperable. According to the Marconi manual and company policy, the wireless operators were not to fix this particular component and would have to wait until getting into port for a certified Marconi engineer to repair the fault. So the wireless operators were faced with an important decision. They could either follow the rules or break them. But ultimately Jack Phillips and junior wireless operator Harold Bride made the decision to break the rules and repair the radio. A decision that would mark the difference between life and death and ensure the story of the Titanic lived on in history. Jack Phillips worked tirelessly even through his allotted time to sleep that day, until he managed to fix the radio system on the afternoon of the 14th of April, just hours before that fateful collision with the iceberg. He was even supposed to be relieved 2 hours early that day, at about midnight, after an incredibly exhausting day fixing the radio and working on transmitting the backlog of messages. But at 11:40 PM, the Titanic struck the iceberg, ripping a huge 300-foot gash along her starboard side, sealing her fate and all those on board. So Jack Phillips, along with Harold Bride, had to continue working, and at 12:15 AM, just half an hour after striking the iceberg, on April 15th, Jack Phillips sent the first distress call, a message that rang out across the Atlantic. CQD MGY 41.46 north by 50.24 west. After the initial CQD distress call was made, junior wireless operator Harold Bride suggested using SOS, half jokingly saying that it might have been his last chance to use the new code, which had only been introduced in 1908 and not really commonly used at the time. Both Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked frantically to send out distress calls, alternating between CQD and SOS, until Captain Smith arrived to tell them that they had done their duty and were relieved. By this point, the forward part of the ship was completely flooded and the situation was dire. However, Jack Phillips stayed at his post working the radio for another 10 minutes or so, frantically contacting nearby ships while Harold Bride went to collect their personal items. Eventually both men ended up splitting up after leaving the wireless room, Harold Bride going forward whilst Jack Phillips went aft. Jack Phillips died that night, but Harold Bride did end up surviving the sinking of the Titanic, but only by the skin of his teeth. He ended up being washed off the deck and somehow managed to cling on to an overturned lifeboat in Collapsible B. But his feet were so badly injured, one was crushed and the other one was frostbitten, to the point that he was barely able to climb on board the Carpathia hours later. Harold Bride was taken to the hospital ward on the Carpathia, but incredibly was later pressed into service again, being wheeled into the wireless room to transmit the names of the Titanic survivors and any personal messages. Later on, at the American inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic, Harold Bride would remember Jack Phillips, working the radio to the very end and recalling, "The water was pretty close up to the boat deck. There was a great scramble aft, and how poor Phillips continued to work through it, I don't know. He was a brave man. I learned to love him that night, and I suddenly felt a great reverence to see him standing there, sticking to his work, while everybody else was raging about. I will never live to forget the work of Phillips during the last awful 15 minutes." And although Jack Phillips did not survive the sinking, his heroism became an enduring part of the Titanic story, not least because of his unwavering commitment to duty, but for also having saved so many souls and for ensuring the story of the Titanic became a global sensation. Today, the story of the Titanic lives on in the hearts and minds of millions of people across the world, a story of bravery, honour and self-sacrifice. And it was thanks to the wireless operators who ensured the Titanic story was not completely lost to the ocean. And by saving the story of the Titanic from sinking into the deep abyss of the ocean, it also prompted international action, including the creation of the International Ice Patrol, and led to the passing of new policy relating to ship safety procedures and construction, and improvements in maritime rights and compensation for injury and loss of life. So I hope you enjoyed this video today and perhaps learned something new. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and comment below and let me know what other videos you'd like me to cover. But until then, stay safe shipmates, and see you all in the next video.